Hi, I'm Amy Blankson, and I have the privilege of teaching you about digital minimalism. Chris Flack introduced this term last week when we were talking about productivity, but as we shift to thinking about how our environment impacts our wellness, I'd like to delve into this idea just a bit more. This section will cover quite a few vocabulary terms that are going to provide a helpful backdrop for you to understand the importance of digital minimalism. I encourage you to jot down any unfamiliar terms and their definitions as we go along because they'll ultimately help you on your recall activities, your reflections, and your exams. Now in this module, we'll be covering 3 different learning objectives. First, we'll define what digital minimalism is. Second, we'll explore the history that's led us to this culture of overconsumption. And third, we'll learn how to effectively curate an environment that will support your digital flourishing. Ready to get started? Let's jump in. So first, what is digital minimalism? Well, digital minimalism is a philosophy, really. It's a philosophy of technology use in which you focus your online time on a small number of carefully selected activities that strongly support the things that you truly value, and then you happily miss out on everything else. Which begs the question, of course, then, well, what's the alternative? What's the opposite of digital minimalism? And you guessed it, it's maximalism. Digital maximalism is a philosophy of tech use that sees the potential benefit of any technology that captures your attention. Think of the latest, greatest, shiny objects, and that's what digital maximalism would go for. Maximalism is driven by novelty, fascination, and of course, the fear of missing out. Whereas minimalism is driven by the need for utility, value, and greater intention. While minimalists may choose to use less tech or even unplug for periods of time, it's worth noting that minimalists are not anti-tech. They're actually pro-healthy tech. They believe in using tech for its best and highest purposes and eliminating any tech that doesn't help that individual to flourish. Why is digital minimalism such an important topic, though? And I think to answer this question, we have to take a trip back in time. In 1965, Gordon E. Moore, the co-founder of Intel, stated what's now called Moore's Law, that the number and the speed of microchips he predicted would double every 2 years or so. And that actually happened. For 50 years, this rule of thumb drove the computing industry. However, in March 2016, the worldwide semiconductor industry formally acknowledged that Moore's Law was nearing its end. Instead, computing was turning to what they creatively called the more than Moore's Law. And by this, they meant that rather than letting microchips determine the applications, the industry wanted to let the applications determine what kind of microchips were actually needed. Well, fast forward to June 2020, just last week, the more than Moore strategy came into play again when Apple announced that it was transitioning to using its own silicon-based chip, moving away from Intel to its own processors. In the long term, this shift will lower the carbon footprint of tech production, which is great, but in the short term, this means that old technologies will soon be obsolete. And while this announcement is the latest in a long line of innovations, the truth is that we're all well acquainted with this upgrade culture. We have been living in it, and we're so familiar with updates and versions and new releases that we're just kept on a treadmill of constant change. In 2015, the United Nations actually warned about the impact of what it called a tsunami of e-waste on global pollution levels. Quite frankly, they warned that if we don't learn how to curb our appetite for stuff and develop systems for recycling or repurposing old tech, we won't have the physical or mental space to handle the future. You ask, well, what else can we do? And I have several actionable strategies for you that I'm going to include for you in the additional resources section down below. But I want to take this time that we have here to delve into some of the psychology behind why we struggle with the overconsumption of technology. And specifically, I want to explore 3 questions. First, I want to look at why we acquire things in the first place. Second, I want to look at why it's so hard to let some things go. And third, I want to talk about how we can stop this cycle. So first, why do we acquire so much stuff? In my book, The Future of Happiness, I call it the technology promise. It's this idea that efficiency will lead to productivity, which will lead to free time, which might lead to happiness. And tech advertising is so effective because it preys upon our desire to find this greater happiness. Take, for instance, one of the original ads for the Roomba vacuum cleaner. The Roomba is your partner for a cleaner home. How often is there too much to do and not enough time to do it? Pretty often. But imagine having an extra hand to help you keep up with daily cleaning and get more done every day. Designed with you and your unique home in mind, we're here to help. You and iRobot, better together. Sounds pretty great, right? The lure of technology is strong. And as you see in this Amazon review for that Roomba, we fall for it hook, line, and sinker. Never vacuum again. I love it, love it, love it. I don't have time to spend vacuuming floors every day. I don't have to worry about under the bed or under the couch. It all gets done for me. It's just so easy. You just push the clean button and away it goes. Wouldn't that be nice? I'm kind of tempted, I have to admit. And on one level, we know that, a vacuum is just a vacuum. But the possibility that it could be more is always intriguing. Tech is like the elusive golden snitch in Harry Potter. We keep chasing it in hopes of winning big. And as humans, we fall into this trap over and over because of something that's called the impact bias. It's a human tendency to overestimate how happy things are going to make us. Could that vacuum save you time? Maybe. Would you use that time to actually do something that brings you joy? Well, that's a trickier question, and it's certainly not one that's guaranteed. When our impact bias is unchecked, we're drawn to these shiny objects and find ourselves on what's called a hedonistic treadmill. We're looking for the latest, greatest new idea to bring us pleasure and spike our dopamine, which is wonderful if you're an investor and you're looking for great new things to spend your money on, but not so great if you're a consumer on a budget. Tech also plays upon our greatest desire for productivity. We think if we can just be more efficient, then we can do more important or more meaningful tasks. Think for a moment of how often you've tried to get ahead of work on Monday by just sending out a few extra emails on Sunday night. But did you know that for every email you send, it statistically generates 4 more emails in return? Emails don't die. They spawn like zombies in The Walking Dead. Even the most efficient technology is subject to an idea that we call in economics the law of diminishing return, meaning that the marginal benefit doesn't create a noticeable difference in input and output, and in fact, it can have quite the opposite effect, and we won't notice it until it's too late. The law of diminishing return says that we have to be more intentional about knowing where the point is that we need to stop and where a point of maximum productivity is. Of course, knowing that these are innate human tendencies, it's important to therefore slough off any extra products and processes that tempt us and keep us from being our best selves. And to do that, we need to look closer at the research around about why it's so hard to let go of some things. So a question for you. How many of you still own a box of cassette tapes? VHS? Maybe an original flip phone? A laptop that has a broken screen or won't turn on? I certainly have quite a few, and not just one drawer. A 2020 study by Declutter.com said that Americans today are sitting on $43 billion of unused tech in their homes. That's just America. Our nostalgia makes us completely irrational technology hoarders. And in the olden days, expensive products were designed to last a lifetime, but of course, with the speed of technology now, cameras, phones, laptops are practically obsolete within 5 years. We struggle with letting go of objects for a variety of reasons. They might be useful. They might have sentimental value. They're worth a lot of money. Maybe they have sensitive data on them. We're suffering from what I call the got syndrome. We feel like we've got to keep these things, even if we haven't touched them in weeks or months, years, or even decades. Interestingly, researchers have found that parting with objects activates the same region in the brain, which is the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, where we feel and process pain. So parting with an old flip phone may elicit the same response in your brain as getting a sharp paper cut or a drink and coffee that's too hot. Ouch, it hurts. Researchers also found that the length of time that you keep an object increases the difficulty of letting go of it. In one study, researchers gave participants all these plain white mugs and these coffee mugs to touch and examine prior to holding an auction. Now, the research varied the amount of time that the participants were able to hold these mugs to see the value and to see whether or not they liked them. And it turns out the amount of time spent would actually predict how much people would be willing to spend on that mug. In fact, the longer that the participants spent holding those mugs, they were willing to pay 60% more for the exact same mug. This just shows us just how much that keeping objects in our environment increases their value to us. But in fact, in reality, if you go to try to sell those objects, and particularly technology, you'll find that the value continues to decrease on a steep decline. Tech itself adds two new complications to what I call the GOT syndrome. First, it's hard to let go of a gadget that we spent $600 on just a year ago, only to find out that its value plummeted as soon as the next model came out. And second, these gadgets carry extremely sensitive data, and we're not exactly sure or confident that they'll be safely disposed of. So these gadgets and these gizmos pile up in dark corners and closets, creating what I call the tech graveyard. And we are all but paralyzed by our fear of letting go of them. So how do we stop this cycle? Well, I have 3 ideas for you. Number 1, the best practice would be to find your why, as Simon Sinek says. Second is to do what I call stop, drop, and sort. And finally, if all else fails, use the really rule. But first, on finding your why. Henry David Thoreau has been coined the original hipster minimalist, opting to live in a cabin shed on Walden Pond to contemplate the meaning of life. And while his experiences may call to our spirits in the long run, the move to the woods may not always be practical or even desired. So instead, Cal Newport, professor of computer science at Georgetown University and author of Digital Minimalism, helps us to identify 3 reasons why cutting back on our consumption can actually benefit us. Number 1, he points out clutter is costly. It's costly to buy clutter, it's costly in terms of space, and it takes up our mental brain power as well. Second, he says optimization matters. You want to be as efficient as possible. And number 3, intentionality should always trump convenience. And I think it's worth mentioning that clutter is completely subjective. While clutter has been shown to hamper performance for the average person, it's actually your perception of clutter that matters most. For some people, like Steve Jobs, a bit of a mess can feel inspiring and productive. These individuals might see a clean office as a dormant area, an indication that no thought or work is actually being undertaken. They see themselves as artists, and they like to have their stuff around them. But on the other hand, people like tree hugger founder Graham Hill prefer absolute simplicity. Hill was famous for trading in his $1 million mansion for a 420 square foot apartment that had only the bare essentials in the kitchen: 12 salad bowls, a fork, a knife, and a spoon. Wow. So you have to think about what is your optimal environment, and by knowing yourself better, it'll determine how much you need to declutter to find your happy place. If you have areas of your life that you feel are overrun by clutter, whether that be physical, digital, or notification clutter, I recommend a method I call stop, drop, and sort. And essentially it means stop putting off the process of organization. I challenge you to put a date on your calendar that you're going to use to devote to this task, and then set micro goals for yourself to take action. In the additional resources section below, I'll put a few links for you that I call happy hacks to get you started on looking at physical, digital, and notification clutter. And lastly, if you find yourself getting stuck with the decluttering process, I encourage you to ask a friend to help you invoke what I call the really rule. What is the really rule? Well, it's a concept that my brother and I joke about from time to time. Several years ago, I was attempting to declutter my house before listing it for sale, and I was really struggling with letting go of some things that I'd had for a long time. My brother happened to be at the house that day, and he obnoxiously started to follow me around the house saying, "Really, Amy? Do you really need that?" He's lucky that he didn't get strangled that day, but I actually appreciated what he did in the end because his question began to echo in my head so often that it actually began to work. It became a mantra for me, a litmus test of sorts, where I started to underscore the question of, does this tech, this app, this gadget, this device, this program truly make me happier and or more productive? For instance, does leaving my cell phone on my desk actually make me more responsive, or does it actually tempt me more to check every alert and notification? Does sleeping with my phone on the bed beside me at night give me good insight into my sleep, or does it actually cause me to go to bed later because I wind up reading myself to sleep or checking the news or looking at Facebook? The beauty of the really rule is that it allows for a wide range of answers and situations, but it always comes back to this question of need, which ultimately helps us to break the cycle of overconsumption. And decision paralysis as well. By reinforcing these questions, it allows us to make space in our lives to welcome in the future with excitement and intentionality rather than with fear. I often say that the future of happiness starts with the choices we make in the present, and digital minimalism is one step in that direction. Thanks so much.